The crystal champagne flute hit the ballroom floor at the same moment his whisper cut through the music. For Rachel Winslow, the museum's quietest curator, the gala had been a research opportunity until a drunk donor's hand on her arm turned it into a cage. Every society figure in the room watched, but did nothing. Then he moved. The host's eldest son, a billionaire heir so reclusive the press called him a ghost, stepped from the shadows, leaned in, and with one sentence, froze 500 of the world's most powerful people in place. This is the story of what happens when a private man makes a very public choice, and how 30 seconds in a ballroom can shatter two carefully constructed lives. To understand that frozen moment, you need to know two people: Rachel Winslow, an expert at preserving ancient history who never expected to become the center of a modern scandal, and Alexander Thorne, the heir who built walls of money and secrecy to avoid a single moment of scrutiny like this. Their worlds were never supposed to collide. But with one act of protection, he didn't just silence a ballroom. He ignited a chain reaction that would expose the carefully buried secrets of a dynasty and force a woman who trusted facts to navigate a world run on power and lies. Rachel Winslow's world was one of dust, documentation, and delicate preservation. As a junior curator at the prestigious Kensington Museum, her expertise was in Etruscan funerary art, a niche so specific that her professional conversations happened with maybe 24 people on the planet. She lived for the quiet hum of climate-controlled rooms, not the deafening glitter of charity balls. Her invitation to the Thorne Foundation Gala wasn't a social coup, it was a bureaucratic accident. The museum's head of development had the flu, his backup had a family emergency, and Rachel's name was next on the rotating list of junior staff required to show face at donor events. Her instructions were simple: be present, be polite, and if anyone asks about the new Etruscan funerary urn acquisition, deflect to the upcoming exhibition catalogue. No one, she was assured, would actually talk to her. Meanwhile, in a penthouse overlooking the same city, Alexander Thorne was preparing for the same event like a general preparing for a tactical retreat. The gala was his mother's domain, the annual showcase for the Thorne Foundation, a philanthropic vehicle that managed an endowment of roughly $1.2 billion. For Alexander, it was a mandatory prison sentence. His reputation for reclusiveness wasn't a media myth. It was a meticulously maintained defense system. While his mother, Elena Thorne, cultivated the spotlight, Alexander ran the actual machinery of the family's wealth, a complex web of holding companies, silent partnerships, and private equity funds. He avoided photographs, gave no interviews, and conducted most of his business through a small team of executors and encrypted channels. His attendance tonight was non-negotiable, but his plan was to arrive late, stand in a pre-scouted shadow near the eastern column, and leave the moment his mother concluded her speech. He had no intention of speaking to anyone. So how did these two trajectories, designed specifically to avoid collision, crash into one another? The answer lies in a third party, Martin Finch. Finch was a hedge fund manager and a relatively new member of the Thorne Foundation's Patrons Circle, a status achieved by donating $250,000 annually. He was also, by multiple accounts, a man who believed his financial contribution purchased more than tax deductions. It bought deference, access, and a certain license of behavior. Rachel, standing alone near a potted orchid, clutching a glass of sparkling water like a lifeline, presented what he mistakenly identified as an easy target, a visibly uncomfortable young woman with no visible escort or allies, an ornament. What happened next was captured not by phones. The gala had a strict no photography policy, but by the collective memory of the elite witness. Finch, emboldened by vintage champagne, approached Rachel. Witnesses would later disagree on the exact words of his initial approach, but they concurred on his posture, his leaning into her space, the way his hand landed on her arm as she tried to step back. Rachel's own training kicked in, a curator's instinct to de-escalate, to preserve the fragile object. In this case herself, she offered a polite, professional deflection. He misinterpreted it as encouragement. His voice grew louder, his grip tightened. A nearby cluster of guests fell silent, looking away with the practiced neutrality of people who know that intervening in a donor's poor behavior is bad for business. This was the ecosystem Alexander Thorne despised. He had seen it his whole life: the transactional cruelty, the way money warped social gravity, bending ethics and basic decency into strange, uncomfortable shapes. From his post near the column, he watched the scene unfold not with surprise, but with a cold, familiar disgust. He recognized Finch. He knew the man's fund was under SEC investigation. He knew his patron's circle status was under review. And he saw a woman, rigid with a panic she was expertly concealing, being treated as part of the evening's entertainment. Alexander's intervention was not chivalrous, it was surgical. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. He simply crossed the room, entered Finch's personal space with an authority so absolute it parted the crowd, and spoke 9 words directly into the man's ear. The content of that whisper has never been publicly confirmed, but its effect was instantaneous and total. Finch's face drained of color. His hand dropped from Rachel's arm as if burned. He took 2 stumbling steps backward, muttered something unintelligible, and vanished into the crowd, heading straight for the exit. The silence that followed was profound. The orchestra, picking up on a cue from the event coordinator, had stopped playing moments before. 500 people held their breath, watching Alexander Thorne. He did not acknowledge them. He turned to Rachel, his expression unreadable, and in a voice meant only for her, asked if she was all right. She nodded, unable to speak. He then offered her his arm. It was not a question. It was an instruction, a piece of performative protection meant for the watching room. To refuse would create a second, even more awkward scene. So Rachel Winslow, her heart hammering against her ribs, placed her hand on the arm of the most mysterious billionaire in the city and let him lead her away from the staring crowd. But this is where the simple narrative of rescue fractures, because Alexander Thorne did not lead her to a quiet corner, offer a comforting drink, and slip away. He led her to his mother, Elena Thorne, a woman whose smile could launch charitable initiatives and end corporate careers, took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance. She saw her reclusive son, physically escorting a flustered young woman she didn't recognize, away from a visible disturbance. She extended a hand to Rachel, her voice a blend of honey and steel. "My dear, you must tell me what happened and who you are." This was the moment Rachel's quiet, controlled life truly ended, because in the eyes of Elena Thorne, she was no longer a junior curator. She was a variable, an anomaly in her son's behavior, a potential problem or a potential opportunity. The car sent to take Rachel home that night was not a taxi. It was a black sedan with tinted windows, driven by a silent man in a suit. As she was driven away from the glittering hotel, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It read, "The driver's name is Leo. He will see you to your door. We will speak tomorrow." She had never given Alexander Thorne her number. Back in her small apartment, surrounded by books on ancient pottery, the surrealism of the evening crashed over her. She replayed the whisper, the silence, the weight of Elena Thorne's gaze. She Googled Alexander Thorne. The results were sparse: a few grainy paparazzi shots, dry business filings listing him as a director, speculative articles about the reclusive heir. There was nothing that explained the sheer, terrifying power he had wielded in that ballroom with a single sentence. The next morning, 2 things arrived simultaneously. First, a delivery of a simple, elegant orchid with a card that bore only the embossed initial T. Second, an email from the Kensington Museum's director requesting Rachel join him in his office at 10 a.m. sharp. When she arrived, she found not just the director, but the head of public relations and the chair of the board's acquisitions committee. They were all, she noted, smiling with a strange, strained enthusiasm. The director cleared his throat. "Rachel, it seems you made quite an impression last night. The Thorne Foundation has just contacted us. They are intensely interested in fast-tracking funding for the new Etruscan wing. And Elena Thorne personally requested you be the museum's liaison for the project." This was the offer, wrapped in the language of career advancement. It was also the trap. To refuse would be professional suicide, a baffling rejection of the largest philanthropic gift the museum had seen in a decade. To accept meant willingly stepping into the orbit of the Thornes, of the man who knew how to find her phone number without asking, and the woman who looked at her and saw a tool. As she sat in that office, the eyes of her superiors upon her, Rachel understood the real stakes of the previous night. Alexander Thorne hadn't just rescued her from a boorish donor. He had, unintentionally or not, pulled her out of the quiet archives and placed her directly on the chessboard of a powerful, secretive family. And now, the game was beginning. The question was, did she even know how to move? Rachel said yes. What choice did she have? To the museum board, her promotion to liaison was a reward. To Rachel, it felt like being reassigned to a beautiful, gilded observation post inside a gilded cage. Her first meeting at the Thorne Foundation headquarters was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following Monday. The building was a sleek tower of glass and steel, a monument to modern efficiency that felt alien compared to the Kensington's hallowed halls. She was met in the lobby not by an assistant, but by Elena Thorne herself. The matriarch was wearing a tailored suit the color of charcoal, and her smile was a calibrated instrument. "Rachel, welcome. Let's dispense with the formalities. You're here because my son broke a pattern. I need to understand why." Elena led her to a private elevator that opened directly into a sun-drenched office with a terrifying view of the entire city. There, standing at the window, was Alexander Thorne. He turned, and for the first time in proper light, Rachel saw the man behind the myth. He was younger than she'd assumed, maybe 35, but his eyes were older. He didn't smile, he simply nodded. "Miss Winslow." "Mr. Thorne," she replied, her curator's composure her only shield. Elena gestured to a seating area. Alexander's intervention with Martin Finch was uncharacteristic. It has created ripples. Finch's Patrons Circle membership has been terminated, which he is contesting. He is claiming he was unfairly maligned, that it was a simple misunderstanding. He is also hinting to anyone who will listen that there's more to the story. She fixed her son with a look. "I need to know what you said to him." Alexander's expression didn't change. "I reminded him that his fund, Apex Ventures, is under investigation for misstating assets. I mentioned the name of the lead SEC investigator, and I suggested that causing a scene with a museum employee connected to our foundation would draw that investigator's attention to his personal conduct at a very inconvenient time." He spoke with the detached clarity of someone reading a financial report. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of cause and effect. Elena's lips thinned. "You used private due diligence as a public cudgel. That creates exposure." "It solved a problem," Alexander countered, his gaze flicking to Rachel, "one that was happening in front of 300 witnesses." The subtext hung in the air, "You would have done nothing." This was Rachel's first real lesson about the Thorne family dynamics. Elena managed the visible empire, the philanthropy, the social capital, the pristine reputation. Alexander managed the hidden one, the money, the leverage, the real power, and they were not always in alignment. Her liaison work began in earnest. It involved weekly meetings, site visits, and a flood of grant proposals. She was given an office at the foundation, a small, quiet room that felt like a holding cell. Alexander was a ghost, appearing only when necessary, his communications terse and via encrypted message. But Elena was a constant, subtle presence. She began inviting Rachel to small, strategic lunches, not with donors, but with lawyers, journalists, and policymakers. A broader education, Elena called it. Rachel felt herself being studied, polished, and positioned. She was learning that in this world, every relationship was a transaction, and she was being assessed as a potential asset. Then came the first major pivot. A month into the role, Rachel was working late at the foundation, reviewing architectural plans for the new wing. The building was nearly empty. Needing a specific financial report from the shared server, she navigated to a directory she wasn't supposed to have access to, a leftover administrative link from a previous user. She didn't find the report. Instead, she found a folder labeled Legacy Assessments. Inside were dossiers. Not on organizations, but on people. Museum directors, city council members, journalists, and one on Martin Finch. It was far more detailed than a standard background check. It included psychological profiles, debt schedules, timelines of marital strife, and notes on leverage points. One line in Finch's file was highlighted: "Subject's primary vulnerability is not financial, it is reputational." He is deeply insecure about his new money, status, and craves acceptance by old institutions. Threat of social exile is more potent than legal threat. Rachel closed the file, her hands cold. This wasn't philanthropy. This was intelligence gathering. Alexander's whisper in the ballroom hadn't been an off-the-cuff remark. It had been a precision strike, using intelligence compiled by his mother's foundation. He hadn't just defended her, He had deployed a calculated weapon from a private arsenal. Confronted with this, Rachel did what she was trained to do. She researched. Quietly from her museum computer, she began digging into the Thorn Foundation's grant history. The public-facing work was impeccable: hospitals, schools, arts funding. But tracing the patterns, she noticed something strange. Major grants often preceded significant zoning changes favorable to Thorn-owned real estate. Donations to political action committees aligned perfectly with the defeat of regulatory bills that would have impacted Thorn Industries. The foundation wasn't just giving away money, it was strategically shaping the landscape in which the Thorn business empire operated. It was influence laundering. She was in the museum archives, cross-referencing a property record, when a voice spoke behind her. "You're asking the right questions, but you're looking in the wrong place." She turned, heart in her throat. It was Leo, the driver from the night of the gala. He wasn't in his suit. He wore casual clothes, and his expression was grim. "Mr. Thorn would like to see you, not at the office, somewhere private." That evening, Leo drove her to a nondescript warehouse in a commercial district. Inside, converted into a stark, secure office, was Alexander Thorn. He stood before a wall of monitors, displaying data streams and news feeds. "You found the assessment files," he said without preamble. Rachel's breath caught. He knew. "I didn't mean to. I know you didn't. The access was a system error, one I had corrected after you triggered the login alert." He turned to face her. "My mother's operation is comprehensive. She believes in understanding the chessboard, every piece." "And you?" Rachel asked, finding her nerve. "What do you believe in?" Alexander was silent for a long moment. "I believe the board is rigged, and the only way to change the game is to own it." He gestured to the screens. "The foundation's grants, the political donations, the dossiers, it's a system. One my grandfather built, my mother perfected. It maintains control. It also prevents worse men than Finch from gaining power." He paused. "My intervention at the gala was not part of the system. It was an anomaly. My mother is trying to determine if you are the cause of that anomaly or merely its catalyst." The revelation was dizzying. Alexander was not a rebellious son trying to escape his family's legacy. He was its reluctant steward, trying to manage its power, occasionally using its tools for his own moral impulses. He saw himself as a contained explosion within the machine, and now Rachel was inside the blast radius. The pressure began to mount from the outside. A society blog ran a coy item: "Who is the mysterious new face charming the Thorns?" A photo, taken from afar, showed Rachel leaving the foundation with Elena. The speculation was benign, but it was a warning shot. Then Martin Finch resurfaced. He gave an interview to a financial podcast, not mentioning names but broadly lamenting cancel culture among the elite, where a simple compliment could be twisted into something nefarious by the whims of the powerful. His allies began whispering. The narrative was being shaped. Rachel as a social climber who'd misinterpreted an innocent interaction, provoking an overreaction from an unstable heir. Rachel's quiet life was gone. Colleagues at the museum looked at her with new curiosity and distance. She received her first piece of hate mail at her apartment, a crumpled note calling her a gold digger. The museum board, initially ecstatic, grew nervous. The Thorn money was now intertwined with potential scandal. Elena's response was to double down. She announced a grand, public groundbreaking ceremony for the Etruscan wing, with Rachel slated to give a speech about the collection. It was a test, a move to cement Rachel's position publicly and call Finch's bluff. "We face the light," Elena told her, "and the shadows retreat." But Rachel felt like a piece being moved directly into the line of fire. The night before the groundbreaking, Alexander came to her museum office. It was past 10. He looked tired. "You don't have to do this tomorrow," he said. "There are other ways. I can arrange a position for you at a museum abroad, London, Rome. You can continue your work away from this." It was the closest he had come to an apology, to acknowledging the trap he had sprung. Rachel looked at the artifacts on her desk, fragments of a civilization that had been swallowed by time. "And if I run," she asked, "what does that make me? A fragile object you had to relocate to preserve?" She shook her head. "I'm not a piece in your collection, Alexander. I'm a person who understands context. And the context is, if I run now, Finch's story becomes the truth. I become the punchline, and your mother's project loses its sheen." You protected me from one kind of humiliation. Running would be another. For the first time, she saw something like respect and something like fear in Alexander's eyes. Then be ready, he said. Finch won't let this go. He's hired a reputation management firm. They specialize in aggressive defense. The morning of the groundbreaking dawned bright and cold. The event was a media circus. Cameras, local dignitaries, the entire museum board. Rachel stood in the wings, her speech folded in her hands. Elena was a vision of poised power at the podium. Alexander stood apart, a dark silhouette watching the crowd. And then, just as Rachel was being introduced, she saw him. Martin Finch, standing at the very back of the press section, wearing a smirk. He wasn't there to protest. He was there to witness. And as Rachel stepped to the microphone, the sea of faces before her, she knew this was no longer about a donation or a wing. This was a battle for the narrative, fought on a stage she never wanted. She took a breath, the words of her prepared speech dissolving in her mind. She had a choice: deliver the safe, sanitized remarks or say something real. The silence stretched, the crowd growing restless. Every eye was on her, waiting. She leaned toward the microphone, her heart hammering against her ribs, and she began to speak. She did not deliver the prepared remarks. The words that came out were simpler, sharper. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady, carrying over the silent crowd. "We are here to celebrate history, but history is not just about objects in cases. It's about context, about understanding the full story." She paused, her eyes finding Finch's smug face in the back. "Recently, I was reminded that power isn't just wealth or position. It's the privilege of controlling a narrative, of deciding which stories are told and which are erased." She didn't name him. She didn't have to. The crowd shifted, a ripple of unease. "This new wing will house artifacts from a culture that left no written history. We interpret them through fragments. We must be careful not to do the same with each other." She concluded with a brief, polite nod to the museum's mission. The applause was polite, confused, but thunderous from the museum staff, who understood exactly what they'd just witnessed. Backstage, Elena Thorne's polished smile was frozen in place, her eyes glacial. "An interesting interpretation," she said to Rachel, each word dipped in frost. "Unexpected." Alexander said nothing. He just watched Rachel with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. The media reaction was split. The arts pages praised her thoughtful and provocative commentary. The society and business blogs dissected it like a coded message. "Junior curator delivers cryptic rebuke at Thorne event," one headline read. Martin Finch's reputation firm went into overdrive. Anonymous sources began feeding a very specific tale to gossip columnists. The story of an ambitious, imaginative young woman from a modest background who might be prone to misreading social situations and seeking drama. But the real grenade landed 3 days later. An investigative journalist with a finance blog, one who had been digging into the SEC investigation of Apex Ventures, published a piece. It didn't mention Rachel. Instead, it asked a pointed question: how did Martin Finch's membership in the prestigious Thorne Foundation's Patrons Circle suddenly get revoked just days before he was formally notified of the SEC's widening probe? The article connected dots: the Gala, Finch's sudden fall from grace, and the Foundation's curiously well-timed disassociation. It framed it not as justice, but as preemptive damage control by the Thornes. The whisper was now a headline: the Thornes used insider regulatory information to surgically remove a problem. Elena was apoplectic. This was the exact exposure she feared. The Foundation's pristine, above-the-fray reputation was now smeared with the hint of collusion and insider knowledge. Donors called, concerned. Alexander was summoned to the penthouse. Rachel, caught in the crossfire, found her liaison role temporarily paused. She was effectively benched, cut off from the project and the Foundation. This was the wait, it gets worse moment, because Alexander's response was not to lay low. He invited the same journalist, a woman named Anya Sharma, to a meeting, and he brought Rachel. "You want the real story?" he asked Sharma in his Stark warehouse office. "The real story isn't about the SEC, it's about what Finch was doing at that gala and 100 others like it. It's about a system that protects people like him because the cost of confrontation is deemed too high to the institutional balance sheet." He slid a file across the table. Not the Foundation's dossier, but a different one, compiled from HR complaints at 3 different charities. from whispers among staff at fundraising firms. It outlined a pattern of behavior by Finch, always carefully stopped just short of legal action, always smoothed over by donations and apologies. "My mother's foundation had this for 8 months," Alexander said, his voice cold. "Their assessment was that confronting him was bad for donor relations. My assessment was that he was a predator, so I used a different lever." Anya Sharma listened, her recorder running. "You're admitting you used non-public financial regulatory information as a weapon." "I'm admitting," Alexander corrected, "that when the designated systems of accountability fail, the powerful have a moral obligation to create consequences, however they can." The article that followed was a bomb. It painted Alexander not as a reckless heir, but as a ruthless pragmatist operating in an ethical gray zone. It painted Elena's foundation as complicit in silencing victims for the sake of harmony, and it painted Rachel as the catalyst, the random element that forced a hidden conflict into the open. The Throne family was now publicly divided, their private debate over power and ethics splashed across the business section. Finch, sensing blood in the water, sued, not for defamation, that was too hard. He sued the Thorne Foundation for breach of contract and wrongful termination of his patron's circle status, claiming their action was based on false pretenses and cost him valuable business connections. It was a nuisance suit designed to force discovery, to drag the foundation's private assessments into a public courtroom. The legal papers arrived at the foundation, and a copy was delivered to Rachel at the museum. She was named as a relevant third party. She was going to be deposed. Her private life, her interpretation of events that night, would be pulled apart by Finch's lawyers. The museum director called her in, his face pale. "Rachel, the board feels, given the legal complexities now involved, it might be best if you took a leave of absence, with pay, of course." She had been forced off the board, isolated. This was the second-order consequence Alexander hadn't fully predicted. The system's immune response was to reject the foreign body, her. That night, Alexander found her at the closed museum, sitting in the dark Etruscan gallery. "I can make the lawsuit go away," he said, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "Finch has weaknesses that aren't in any dossier, real ones." "How?" Rachel asked, exhausted. "By being worse than he is," Alexander replied simply. "By leveraging things that have nothing to do with the gala. I can crush him, it would be easy." Rachel looked at the ancient funerary urns, symbols of a journey to another world. "That's the problem, isn't it? It's always easy for you. That's why you did it at the gala. It was the easiest solution for you in the moment. You didn't think about what happened to the person you were protecting after you walked away." For the first time, she saw genuine shame flicker across his face. "You're right," he admitted. "I saw a problem I could fix with a sentence. I didn't see the chain reaction. I was arrogant." This was the pivotal shift. The protector realized he was also the destabilizing force. "So what do we do?" Rachel asked. "We," Alexander echoed. "You're in this because of me. And I'm staying in it," she said, a fierce determination hardening within her. "Not for you, for me. I gave that speech. I spoke my truth into that microphone. I'm not going to let Finch or your mother's politics or a scared museum board erase it. So we find a way that doesn't involve you being worse. We use the system." Alexander almost smiled. "The system is rigged. Then we unrig it," Rachel said, "with the one thing they can't manipulate, verifiable public fact." They devised a risky plan. Rachel would not hide from the deposition. She would lean into it. She would testify clearly and calmly to exactly what happened. But more importantly, she and Anya Sharma would work together. Rachel would help Sharma find the other women hinted at in Alexander's file, the ones with HR complaints and silent stories. They would go on the record, not about Finch's financial dealings, but about his behavior. They would shift the narrative from a battle of billionaires to a pattern of misconduct enabled by institutional cowardice. It was dangerous. It would make Rachel the public face of a scorched earth campaign. It would permanently burn her bridges with the genteel world of museum philanthropy. And it would force Elena Thorne to pick a side, stand with the old way of quiet protection, or publicly align with this new, messy truth. The day of Rachel's deposition arrived. She walked into the law offices, accompanied not by a Thorne lawyer, but by her own, paid for by a surprisingly insistent Alexander. In the hallway, she passed Martin Finch. He leaned in, his voice a sneer. Ready for your close-up, dear? This is where your fairy tale ends. Rachel didn't break stride. This isn't a story, she said, not even looking at him. It's a deposition. We deal in facts here. Inside the room, under oath, she was precise. She described the gala, the pressure of Finch's grip, her feeling of being trapped. She was asked about Alexander. What was your relationship with Mr. Thorne prior to that evening? Non-existent, she answered truthfully. Did he ask for anything in return for his intervention? No. The questions tried to lead her to imply a conspiracy or an affair. She stuck to the facts. And as she walked out hours later, drained but clear, Anya Sharma published the new piece. It featured 3 anonymous accounts, meticulously verified, detailing Finch's behavior at industry events. The headline was brutal: the pattern behind the patron, the women silenced by Martin Finch's charity. The lawsuit was no longer about contracts, it was about character. The public tide turned, swiftly and decisively. Other donors distanced themselves from Finch. His remaining board seats resigned. The Thorne Foundation, seeing the shift, issued a powerful statement from Alina, praising the courage of those who come forward and announcing a new, independent committee to review all patron conduct. It was a masterful pivot, absorbing the energy of the scandal to reform the system. Alina had chosen to ride the wave, not fight it. In the aftermath, Rachel resigned from the Kensington. They accepted it with relief. Alexander offered her a job, a real one, heading a new independent initiative he was funding, an audit firm for non-profit ethics. She turned him down. I need to build something that's mine, she told him, something that doesn't have your name on the door. He understood. He didn't like it, but he understood. For the first time, their relationship existed in a space of equals, not protector and protected. It was fraught, complicated, and alive with possibility. But just as the dust seemed to settle, a final envelope arrived. It contained no letter, just a single grainy photocopy. It was a page from a decades-old private investigator's report, commissioned by Alexander's grandfather. The subject was a young artist from the 1970s. The summary described a paternity claim against the Thorne patriarch, quietly settled with a trust fund. The name of the artist was Alina Thorne. The page was unsigned, but its origin was clear: Martin Finch's last, desperate shot. He wasn't targeting the business. He was targeting the family's origin story. He was revealing that Alina, the pillar of old money respectability, was the product of the very kind of scandal she now professionally managed. The foundation of the Thorne legacy was not pristine. It was a secret, paid off and buried. Alexander showed it to Rachel, his face ashen. If this gets out, it destroys her. It unravels everything she's built. Rachel looked at the page, then at him. So what do you do? She asked, throwing his old dilemma back at him. Protect the system by hiding the truth, or let it fall? Alexander stared at the damning document, the weight of generations in his hands. The gala, the whisper, the lawsuit, it had all been a prelude. This was the real battle, not for reputation but for identity. He had to choose between the mother who raised him in a gilded lie and the unforgiving truth that could liberate them both. He looked at Rachel, the woman who had refused to let her story be rewritten. He knew what she would do. The question was, did he have the same courage? Alexander Thorne did not sleep that night. He sat in his warehouse office, the single damning page on the desk, caught between 2 impossible choices. To protect his mother was to perpetuate the very lie that had built their world, a world he had just spent months destabilizing in the name of truth. To expose it was to destroy the woman who had shaped him, and to unleash a scandal that would make the Finch affair look like a minor skirmish. At dawn, he went to the penthouse. He found Alina in her conservatory, tending to her orchids. She took one look at his face and knew. He sent it to you too, she said, her voice unnervingly calm. She set down her shears. I wondered when it would surface. The story she told him was not the one he expected. Alina Thorne was indeed the daughter of the artist and the patriarch, but the trust fund wasn't hush money. It was an inheritance, fought for by her mother to give her a chance. The scandal was not in her birth, but in the old man's refusal to publicly acknowledge her, to grant her his name until he was on his deathbed. Alina had spent her entire life not hiding from the truth, but building a fortress of respectability so impregnable that no one would dare use her origins against her. The foundation, the social capital, the pristine reputation, it was all a deliberate, monumental act of self-defense. I built this, she told her son, so that you would never have to fight for your place, so that your power would be unquestioned. And now you're risking it all for what? For a principle. Alexander looked at his mother, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time. He saw not a manipulator, but a survivor. And he understood his own inheritance, not just wealth, but a legacy of defiance disguised as conformity. I'm not risking it for a principle, he said. I'm risking it because the fortress is a prison, for you, for me, for everyone inside. He told her his decision. He would not leak the document, but he would not let it hang over them either. He was going to Alina's next major donor luncheon, and he was going to speak. The luncheon was at the Metropolitan Club, a room steeped in old-world power. The guest list was a who's who of the foundation's most conservative backers. Alina was to give a speech about legacy. As she introduced her son, a rare public appearance, the room buzzed. Alexander stepped to the podium. He did not smile. He held up a single sheet of paper. Some of you may have heard rumors, he began, his voice carrying in the hushed room. About my family, about secrets. Today I want to end them. He then did the unthinkable. He told them the truth, not the salacious details, but the core fact, that Alina Thorne was the acknowledged daughter of the family patriarch, that her life's work was built not on inherited privilege, but on a determined claim to legitimacy. We have built an institution on the idea of giving opportunities, he said. It's time we acknowledged that our own story begins with someone who had to fight for hers. The reaction in the room was stunned silence, then a wave of murmured shock. But something else happened too. A few of the older women of formidable social stature, nodded. One even raised her glass in a silent toast. They understood the subtext. In that world, every family had a secret. By owning his, Alexander had transformed it from a weapon into a shield. He had called their bluff. The story, when it inevitably leaked to Anya Sharma's blog, was framed not as a scandal, but as a revelation of resilience. The Thorne Foundation's donations increased that quarter. Martin Finch, deprived of his final weapon and facing a mounting pile of bad press and the sudden cold shoulder from his remaining allies, quietly dropped his lawsuit. He sold his hedge fund and moved to Palm Beach. The system, when it finally turned, did so with a quiet, absolute finality. In the aftermath, Alina Thorne announced her semi-retirement. She remained the public face of the foundation, but the internal machinery, the assessment files, the strategic leverage, she ceded that to Alexander. On one condition, he would dismantle it. He would build a new system, one with transparency and external oversight. He agreed. Rachel Winslow did not return to the Kensington. Using a portion of the settlement from a separate, quietly filed lawsuit against Martin Finch for intentional infliction of emotional distress, a suit Alexander's lawyers helped structure, she founded her own consultancy, not in ethics, but in something she called contextual preservation. She helped cultural institutions navigate modern crises, not by hiding their histories, but by integrating them. Her first client was a museum dealing with the problematic legacy of a colonial-era donor. She was good at it. She and Alexander did not have a fairy tale romance. They had something more complex and more real. They saw each other, not as rescuer and victim, but as two people who had been fundamentally altered by a collision of worlds. They were partners in a sense, but on their own terms. Sometimes they spent a week together, talking late into the night about power and history and the weight of the past. Sometimes they went months without speaking, each immersed in building their new lives. The connection was never simple, but it was permanent. 5 years after the gala, Rachel published a book. It was not a memoir. It was a scholarly work titled Fragments and Wholes, Reconstructing Narrative in Modern Institutions. It was well reviewed in academic circles. On page 47, in a footnote about case studies, she wrote, "The author is indebted to AT for demonstrating that the most powerful context is often the one we are afraid to provide. Those who knew, knew." The final surprising detail came on the book's launch day. Rachel held the event at the very same ballroom at the Rothmore Hotel. It was a different kind of gala, smaller, filled with academics and artists. As she gave her talk, a figure stood in the back near the same column. Alexander Thorne, watching, not as a protector but as a guest. As she finished, he didn't approach the podium. He simply caught her eye from across the room, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and left. She didn't need him to stay. His presence was an acknowledgement, a closing of a loop. The whisper that had once frozen a room was now a silent understanding between two people who had reshaped each other's destinies. The ballroom did not freeze this time. It buzzed with conversation about ideas, about history, about the future. Rachel Winslow, once an expert on ancient funerary art, had become an architect of modern legacy. And Alexander Thorne, the reclusive heir, had learned that true power isn't in the silence you command, but in the truth you allow to be spoken. Their dance was over. Their work and their lives continued. Separately and yet forever connected by the night, he stepped from the shadows, and she stepped into the light. So what remains of that single frozen moment in the ballroom? Not a fairy tale, but a blueprint. A map of how a random act of intervention can become a catalyst, cracking open gilded cages and letting in the uncomfortable, necessary air of truth. This story was never about a rescue. It was about a collision between the curated world of power and the unvarnished reality of experience. And in that collision, both were remade. Alexander Thorne learned that protection without agency is just another form of control, that wielding power responsibly doesn't mean hiding its mechanisms, but rebuilding them with better intentions. He continues to run the Thorne empire, but the foundation now publishes its grant-making criteria and has an external ethics board. The dossiers were destroyed. He has not given another interview. Rachel Winslow learned that context is everything, and that sometimes the most radical act is to provide it. Her consultancy thrives, advising institutions that the past is not a liability to be managed, but a foundation to be understood. She never married. She never needed to. Elena Thorne, in her semi-retirement, established a new scholarship in her mother's name for daughters of unacknowledged artists. The fortress she built became a museum, and she is, at last, its curator, not its prisoner. The Kensington Museum's Etruscan wing opened to critical acclaim. The plaque in the lobby thanks the Thorne Foundation for its generous support. It does not mention the quiet curator who almost lost her career to secure it, or the heir who risked his legacy to defend her. Some histories are written in the official record. Others are written in the choices people make afterward. The lingering question this story leaves us with is this: in a world that rewards silence and punishes disruption, when do we choose to speak? When do we step from the shadows? Because every system, every institution, every gilded room is maintained by the unspoken agreement of those within it. And sometimes, all it takes is one broken glass, one whispered sentence, one person refusing to play their assigned role to change the entire architecture of power. We tell these stories not as fantasies, but as reminders that the moments which feel most isolating, the public humiliations, the private doubts, the times we stand alone, are often the seeds of our greatest transformations. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that some truths are worth the cost of telling them. If you found a moment of truth in this story, if it reminded you of a time you chose to speak or to listen, then share this with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe, because every week we dive deep into another story where a single moment changed everything: the hidden histories, the quiet rebellions, and the extraordinary courage of ordinary people. Your subscription turns the page to the next chapter. Thanks for listening.